Hello. Hi from Chicago. I'd like to thank the Sorbonne Nouvelle, the Temenos Academy, and especially the conference organizers for allowing me to participate in this conference, even in this attenuated way. I apologize that I can't be there in person, and I wish you all a wonderful time at the conference. So my paper is entitled Kathleen Raine, Porphyry's De Antro Nympharum, and the Lineage of Esoteric Criticism. The noetic knowledge to which the imagination affords access is not so much a matter of the contents of consciousness as it is of a heightened and deepened awareness of the encompassing framework within which those contents appear. This introduces a basic problem of reference, as reference always pertains to a relationship between those contents. Operating outside of this field of reference, the symbols that exemplify or instantiate imaginative capacity are necessarily self-evident, which means their explanation can only ever sound like paraphrase at best. Within the history of cultures, this paraphrase shows up as influence. Kathleen Raine's retrieval of one such influence, the presence of the Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyry's exegetical treatise De Antro Nympharum, or Concerning the Cave of the Nymphs, within the symbolic lexicon and grammar of William Blake's 1821 painting, The Sea of Time and Space, vision of the cycle of the life of man, stands at the threshold of her entire critical project. 5 years prior to the publication of Defending Ancient Springs, her first book of literary criticism, Raine opened her 1962 presentation for the Andrew Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts with an extensive close reading of Blake's painting through the framework Porphyry's essay provided. The essay's influence on Blake's symbolism in the painting is thus concrete evidence, among other things, of Blake's close familiarity with the works of English translator and Neoplatonist Thomas Taylor, whose edition of Porphyry's essay first entered public circulation in 1788. Blake's complicated relationship with Thomas Taylor the Platonist seemed to have begun as early as the 1780s and flowed through several possible channels. Foster Damon had suggested that Taylor appears under the guise of Sipsop the Pythagorean in 1784's An Island in the Moon. Raine speculated on the likelihood that Blake had attended a series of lectures on Platonism that the English pagan had given at the house of the sculptor and draftsman John Flaxman, prior to Flaxman's departure to England in 1787. But the acquaintance may also have come, Raine suggested, through either George Cumberland or Mary Wollstonecraft. At any rate, despite the early familiarity with his work, Blake's relationship to both Taylor and to Platonism more generally were fluid and changeable. As Raine explored, for example, in Blake and Taylor's very different reactions to Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women in 1792's Visions of the Daughters of Albion and 1793's animal rights pamphlet, Vindication of the Rights of Brutes, respectively. The presence of Porphyry's treatise in a work from as late as 1823 thus testified to the enduring influence of a particular strain of Platonic tradition on Blake's sensibility. This work, Raine remarks, painted with such evident love, such a wealth of symbolic detail, makes it plain that he never forgot a work which had given him his own essential myths. Taylor's Platonism, Raine also observed, was essentially that of the Neoplatonists and above all of Proclus. To locate Taylor in such a line is to locate Plato himself within a line extending back to the Pythagorean and Orphic traditions that inform the mythic content of the dialogues. What Gregory Shaw has called the hieratic strain of Neoplatonism, branching after Plotinus from Iamblichus to Proclus into Marsilio Ficino and beyond, self-consciously positioned itself along the side of what Raine called the revealed wisdom of antiquity. Raine argued that the continuity of Platonism in Blake's work stemmed from the presence of two, in many respects contradictory, aspects of Plato's thought, logos and mythos. Blake rejected the former with no less vigor than he continued to embrace the latter. Considering these affinities, it is not surprising that Taylor would have embraced Porphyry's treatise on a passage from Book 13 of the Odyssey, following the Phaeacians' return of Odysseus to the harbor of Ithaca. Porphyry presents his case for reading Homer as a theologian transmitting the wisdom of the ancients, not so much dogmatically as inductively, stating at the essay's outset, one is inclined to wonder what on earth the cave in Ithaca means for Homer, the one he describes in the following words. And here I quote the passage in its entirety from Robert Lamberton's translation. And at the head of the harbor is a slender-leaved olive, and nearby it a lovely and murky cave, sacred to the nymphs called naiads. Within are craters and amphoras of stone, where bees lay up stores of honey. Inside, too, are massive stone looms, and there the nymphs weave sea-purple cloth, a wonder to see. The water flows unceasingly. The cave has two gates, the one from the north, a path for men to descend, while the other, toward the south, is divine. Men do not enter by this one, but it is rather a path for immortals. To whatever degree Porphyry reads Neoplatonic doctrine into this passage, his point of departure is first and foremost hermeneutic and interpretive. Drawing upon the precedent of allegorical interpretations of Homer developed by Neo-Pythagorean philosophers Numenius and Cronius, Porphyry points out that the language here can't be explained referentially. The geographical writers show that on the one hand, Homer has not provided a description of actual things passed down by tradition because they mention nothing of such a cave in the island, or so Cronius claims. Despite their resonance with other motifs scattered throughout the Odyssey, particularly that of weaving, the wealth of symbolic details condensed within this short passage, the naiad nymphs, stone craters and amphorae, bees and honey, sea purple cloth, two gates, and olive tree, are difficult to account for within the epic's thematic economy. The symbolic density of the passage, combined with its non-referentiality, motivates Porphyry's turn toward an allegorical interpretation. Given that the description is full of such obscurities, Cronius concludes that it is not, in fact, a casual fiction created for our amusement, but neither is it a geographically accurate description. And so the poet must be saying something beyond the obvious here. Likewise, he has placed the olive tree nearby for some mysterious reason. Even the ancients, he says, considered it a major task to track down and develop all these things. And now we must attempt to understand them with the help of those who have gone before us and of our own perceptions. Viewing the contents of the passage and essay through this framework as constituting links in a chain comprised of interpretive acts, understanding by interpretation the intellection of symbolic forms, we can understand Raine's view that the text had implications which are at present time more than academic. They concern our whole approach to the nature and purpose of the arts. Such implications become apparent in the cosmology Porphyry unfolds from his reading of the Homeric passage. Nilefor Akçay has remarked that Porphyry provides his audiences with a way of gradually training their minds through ancient texts, which are not easily grasped since they reveal other things beyond the surface meanings. The other things revealed or connoted are not referents, material objects or mental concepts, what Edmund Husserl associated with noema or the noematic, but intelligible dimensions within which both material and mental objects appear. The cave's status as a symbol of the cosmos itself illustrates why this distinction between object and frame can only be approached by means of examples. Citing the Persian mystagogues associated with the Mithraic mysteries and the Hesiodic myths as precedents, Porphyry proposes a long-standing pattern among the ancients of making the cave a symbol of the generated and perceptible cosmos, and likewise taking it as a symbol of all the unseen powers, since caves are dark and it is the nature of these powers to be invisible. This entire cosmological drama, produced at the level of symbolic resonances within the cave, can be seen as a variation on Jacques Lacan's observation that there is no meta-language, no position from which the process of reference can step outside of and comment on its own operations, here implicating conscious experience as a whole. In Raine's paraphrase, the world, says Porphyry, is very lovely indeed to him who enters it, but obscure to him who surveys its foundations and examines it with an intellectual eye, so that its exterior and superficial parts are pleasant, but its interior and profound parts are obscure, and its very bottom is darkness itself. The operations undergirding our experience of a world are necessarily, structurally obscure to us because we live their products, while conversely, the very fabric of that experience provides everywhere a visible sign and exemplification of those same operations. Darkness is a figure for the fact that the impossibility of a meta-language, due to the mind's weddedness to the world, renders the apparent lucidity of factual description a blind man's bluff. Thus, for Porphyry, the theologians made caves symbols of the sensible cosmos because they are dark and rocky and damp, and the cosmos likewise has these properties because of the matter from which it sprung, and it resists form and is unstable, while they made cave symbols of the noetic universe, on the other hand, because they are not easily grasped by the senses, and at the same time, they are essentially solid and enduring. The cave itself embodies the ambivalent logic of the symbol. This Janus-based character, both of the symbol, qua sensible and intelligible, and of the generated cosmos itself, defines the cave's contents as well. Here it is apposite to follow Blake's reception of these contents in the sea of time and space. Raine symbolized this reception of Neoplatonic tradition as an underground river that flows through European history, sending up from time to time springs and fountains, and wherever its fertilizing stream emerges, there imaginative thought revives, and we have a period of great art and poetry. In Porphyry's reception of Homer's cave, the waters and the naiads who preside over springs and who are called naiads from the waters out of which streams flow, nausi, become figures of sensibility, what Kant called the sensuous intuition of spatio-temporal categories, or in more properly metaphysical terms, of the powers of materiality whose moistening compulsions constitute the soul's descent into genesis. The powers presiding over the phenomenal world mark the paths of the soul's ingress and egress, and passage beyond the cave's obscurity occurs through their productions. Blake's sea is split into two panels divided by a pair of trees. On the left, Odysseus turns his face away from the sea where, in Raine's reading, he has thrown back Leucothea's girdle, and towards a figure Raine identifies as Athena, embodiment of phronesis, or practical wisdom, who in Porphyry's account presides over the olive tree Homer has placed outside of the cave. Athena tilts her head towards Odysseus and looks towards the sea while raising her hand upward toward the realm of intelligible forms. Her own form is wrapped in a diaphanous garment, not unlike the sea purple cloths woven by the nymphs. On the right, a single nymph bearing a water bucket ascends a staircase against the stream of three descending nymphs, each bearing loom shuttles, their arms raised in a vigorous activity of weaving. Below the ascending nymph's feet, a female figure languishes half submerged in water, while atop the staircase move a circle of figures bearing their water vessels on their heads. The main figure's ascent, Raine tells us, is opposed by the nymphs, for she is a dry soul and her purpose is contrary to their nature and function. Unlike Yeats, who wondered what mother contemplating the shape upon her lap honey of generation had betrayed would be compensated for the pain of its birth upon seeing it aged, Blake's painting has not incorporated the bees and honey that fill the stone craters and amphorae, Homer's other ambivalent symbol of genesis in Porphyry's reading. This is instructive as it tells us something about the nature of this allegorical reading, that it cannot be reduced to the relations between signs that structuralists like Claude Lévi-Strauss imagined. The whole cosmology is intact in Blake's rendition, though bees, stone looms, and the two gates of the cave that Porphyry interprets astrologically are no less symbolically pregnant for all that. These are mereological part-whole relationships rather than contiguous ones. The passage is a kind of archive of these symbols. of which Raine tells us no symbol of power has a single source. Thus, while Blake and Yeats pull symbols out of Porphyry's essay as what Ezra Pound called germinal ideas and stitch them into their own tapestries, we see Porphyry on the other end of history looking backward, seeing these sensuous and intellective images dispersed throughout the inherited tradition of the ancients. A cave in an Empedoclean fragment, an ablution of honey in a Mithraic initiation, a swarm of souls in Sophocles, Corre weaving garments in an Orphic fragment. The poet Charles Olson wrote, "The error of all metaphysic is descriptive." The distinction, again, is a matter of symbolic or signifying modality, and so the mode of intelligibility. Metaphysical systems are the products of discursive thought. Today, we might replace metaphysical doctrine with theory. If we approach Porphyry's text at the level of doctrine, we find confused syncretism. The cave of Mithraic initiation is not that of Plato's Republic. But Carl Jung could not explain what the sun vision of the Mithras liturgy was doing showing up in the hallucinations of a patient in Burgholzli Mental Hospital in Zurich. What Raine recognized in Porphyry's text that the disciplinary methods of the classics may necessarily obscure is that De Antro Nympharum is a work embodying the Blakean vision and that of Romanticism more generally avant la lettre. No less than it is a testimony to the long historical duration of the faculty Raine called imaginative insight, whose nascent form is myth and whose modern sequestration is aesthetic judgment. By 1977, when theories of literature were supplanting older reading practices forged in Romantic doctrine, Raine could speak with her own prophetic clarity. I discovered, as others who have done the same, that Blake was drawing upon a tradition rich in literature, age-old, continuous, coherent, whose members were as reputable as Plato and Plotinus. The great body of excluded knowledge has long been unacceptable, not on account of its inaccessibility, still less of its paucity, but because its premises run counter to those of a materialist civilization. Counter, I might add, as Blake's Nymphs' upward ascent runs counter to the three descending nymphs. Raine's statement warrants further attention. What is the basis of the opposition between the premises of excluded knowledge and those of materialist civilization? Here I venture the suggestion that Raine's excluded knowledge refers not primarily to contents of knowledge, but to its means. Raine's own remarks on the learning of the imagination support this distinction. Poetry and the other arts are basic modalities of human thought, concerned not with knowledge about, but with knowledge of, as music itself is its own meaning. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in a letter to John Thelwall that Raine often cites as further evidence of Thomas Taylor's formative influence on Romanticism, writes, "Metaphysics, poetry, and facts of mind, i.e. accounts of all the strange phantasms that ever possessed your philosophy dreamers from Thoth the Egyptian to Taylor the English pagan, are my darling studies." Kantian aesthetics, in distinguishing determinate conceptual judgments from reflective judgments of taste, secured that the latter could only ever entail the free play of subjective faculties, rather than quasi-empirical intuitions of non-material facts that Coleridge's phrase implies. Though the critique of teleological judgment seems to hold open the possibility for an intellectual and not merely sensuous intuition. Raine recognized in Henry Corbin's concept of the imaginal, a concept derived from Suravardi's Zoroastrian, Hermetic, and Platonic reaction against the Arab peripatetics, the nearest modern formulation of the imagination as nothing less than the fundamental ground of knowledge that she saw in Blake and the Romantics. Porphyry's cosmology of Homer's cave is metaphysical insofar as it postulates facts of mind, objective realities whose ontology is mental rather than physical, the knowledge of which is excluded by empiricist culture, like precognitive dreams and other findings of parapsychology. But it does so by means of the symbolic mode of knowing characteristically identified after Romanticism as the imagination. For Raine, imaginative knowledge is immediate knowledge, like a tree or a rose or a waterfall or sun or stars. Immediate in the sense that it is not about anything, but is itself the immediate communication of meaning. Such non-referentiality is what Blake means by vision, and explains why he could adopt some symbols from Porphyry's text without needing the whole architecture. To treat imaginative insight as excluded knowledge is to see these symbols as deriving their force not from human linguistic conventions, but from their participation in that ontologically objective realm. But the evidence for such a domain might conversely depend on our accessing such non-referential intelligibility. While Raine expressed optimism in 1977 that the excluded knowledge of the last 2 or 3 centuries seems likely to become the sacred scriptures of a new age for which the spirit, not matter, is again the primary reality, an optimism she would maintain in her 2002 preface to the Routledge Classics edition of Blake and Tradition. Our own reign of quantity and calculation that reduces institutional, humanistic, and literary education to reportage on empirical fact, according to the sociological preferences dictated by the media and the press, presents a host of challenges to the recuperation and preservation of that excluded knowledge. But the long durational scope it was Raine's mission to reveal, not least in the sea of time and space, enables us to see our present situation within a profounder awareness of its framework. And so, with Blake's Los, keep the divine vision in time of trouble. So thank you very much for your time. And if anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, or reactions, you can email me at ealexander3@uchicago.edu. So thank you.
I was interested in one aspect, which was the in the analysis of the Odyssey. You know, I was thinking constantly of the comparison between the Odyssey and the Old Testament in Auerbach, and when he talks about the Homer's invention of literature, basically through his emphasis on detail over allegorical reading. I don't know if everybody sees what I'm alluding to, but there's a whole development in Auerbach in his chapter on Odyssey about the fact that what founds the Homeric text is precisely the fact that Homer makes the adventures of Ulysses so vivid by choosing specific details, very similar to what Butler would later call the reality effect. You know, and I was just wondering, not being a Kathleen Raine scholar myself, you know, I was just wondering to what extent she used this notion of the literary, because to me it seems that one of the topics we've been discussing is how text should be read following a methodology which has to do with deciphering, with reaching some kind of hidden esoteric meaning. So yeah, that was what was in my mind as I was listening to Edward's paper. So yeah, the importance of the literary in Kathleen Raine.
Okay, so someone wants to.
But if it's just a kind of solitary interest, we can move on.
Importance of the literary. That's important. Very good point, I would say, like Jenny said.
Thank you. Yes, like other papers, perhaps even more than some we've already heard. I mean, this encourages one to start rethinking and rereading a whole segment of Kathleen's work, so it's very challenging. I think possibly an interesting aspect, and maybe a tension in Kathleen's work, I don't know whether others would agree with this, is that in a way she approaches Blake and she approaches Blake's reading of other authors very much in the sense of someone looking at a text which they regard as esoteric and which, to put it crudely, has a hidden meaning. And she approaches her own life as, if you like, a kind of text which also has a hidden meaning, and she writes that text so as to bring the meaning out. And Kathleen herself did have esoteric training. I won't say more about that, but she did. But on the whole, she seems to me an interesting example of a kind of esoteric writer who isn't explicitly esoteric. She's not like Yeats, for example, who to some extent parades bits and pieces of his esoteric knowledge. And yet she makes this assumption that most significant literature is in some sense esoteric. I don't quite know what to make of this, but it seems to be highlighted by this, where you've got a process of authors deciphering other authors. She deciphers Blake, Blake deciphers Porphyry, Porphyry deciphers Homer, and it echoes back and back and back and back, and in a way, these meanings keep on being revealed, and yet somehow they're always hidden at the same time. I don't feel I can say anything very coherent about this, but it suddenly brought this up, and it seems interesting.
But in Edward's present summary of his paper, he emphasized sort of two lines in a kind of continuum of literary criticism. One, which he associated with Aristotle, which would be a kind of pragmatic of the text. And I would associate with what Barthes called the pleasure of the text, you know, a pure kind of textual pleasure. And on the other hand, the Platonic tradition, which would view a literary text as having a further meaning, which had to be deciphered. And it's interesting you mentioned Yeats, because I think when I started working on Yeats, it became very clear that there were two schools for reading Yeats. The esoteric school and the modernist or the textual school. I tend to belong to the latter, so, but for lack of training also. And I just thought, yeah, but you've answered my question. So I was just wondering if for Kathleen Raine there was any explicit mention of the of the literary pleasure disconnected from any kind of interpretation or any kind of and if I understand correctly, it seems that she associated the two. You couldn't dissociate the interpretation and the purely.
I think that's probably right. And I think for Kathleen, the pleasure came from the recognition of truth. When we recognize the truth, when, if you like, we decipher the mystery, we immediately feel joy because we see ourselves in it, we see the meaning of our world in it. So the pleasure comes from the recognition.
And I think Yeats would have said that also.
Yeah, Yeats is full of passages about, for example, something drops from eyes long blind. We complete our partial mind. A recognition is what's important.
Thank you. Can you say that?
Sorry, but doesn't she write also from the body? Not only for the question to what to Linda. Yeah.
Céline, you want to try and answer?
I don't know. I'd have to think about this for too long. I don't want to be the person who has to answer the questions.
Okay, I'll give the mic to Céline, but I think she might have some sort of answer. Do you?
I'm not sure, but maybe I'm going to answer as a dancer, because she has so many references to dancing. And I think when you dance, it's recognition, as you said, but through the words of your body. It's a sort of intuitive logos that is coming, and whenever she dances to the world, to the sun, to the rain, to the mountains, I think there is this sort of ecstasy from the body also, and they're intertwined, in fact, because the recognition of the mystery is also found through the body, indeed, as a woman, and sometimes she wants to be out of this body, because the body is the incarnation, and sometimes you would like to be pure soul. So we have this constant back and forth between wanting to be a real body in this world and experiencing the light and the music through the body, and at the same time a sort of need to be burnt totally from the self, and to be mentally dissolved into the universe, and this is to be out of the body. And what is interesting is that when you dance, it's the word is the stasis, you're motionless, and when you go in ecstasy, then you go out of this motionlessness and you become movement. And I think poetry and writing and what Kathleen Raine is seeking is this perpetual movement. And so indeed we have this body and this soul being together in order to define ecstasy and recognition all the time. And the pleasure is also through the body. In fact, I think yes, but I'm just answering as a dancer. And we were having this nice conversation at the break, and it's true that whenever you dance with somebody, then you know the soul of that person without talking. So I think whenever she makes references to this act of moving, it's a way of being a poet also, to be constantly in movement and never to be in this motionlessness which is linked with death. And so I think poetry is the way of being in this sort of everlasting life, so everlasting movement. I don't know if it's an answer, it's just a...